Come in. Mind your head on the beam. Low ceilings in these parts. That's it. Get yourself close to the fire. The wind coming off the mountain tonight cuts right through you, doesn't it? It's that damp cold you get in the Welsh Marches. Seeps into your bones. Here, let me pour you something to keep the cold at bay. This ale's been in the cask since harvest, and it'll warm you right through to your bones. You'll notice we keep a measure aside. See there, on the mantelpiece. That Pwca Cup, never quite empty, never quite full. Old custom, that. Pour one for the Pwca before you lock up for the night. The fair folk, you understand. Or the goblin, depending who you ask. Different words for the same thing. The understanding that in certain places, the living aren't the only ones keeping house. This valley learned that lesson long ago, and those who forget it don't fare well. This inn's been standing since William the Conqueror's grandson sat on the throne. 1110, they say, though the stones remember even older foundations. The monks from Abingdon built the first version as a hospice for pilgrims making their way to Llanthony Priory, up in the cleft of the mountains. A holy house, meant to be. Sanctuary for the weary, shelter for the faithful. But holiness and horror have a way of sleeping in the same bed in these borderlands, and what began as refuge became something else entirely. Look up through that window there if the clouds break. You'll see the dark bulk of his Skirrid Far, the Skirrid Mountain, though mountain's a generous word for it. More of a ridge, really, but what it lacks in height it makes up for in reputation. The Holy Mountain, they call it. The mountain that wept. The old story says it split in two the moment Christ died on the cross. The earth itself couldn't bear the weight of that death, so it tore open, right down to the bedrock. You can still see the scar if you climb it. A great fissure running through the sandstone like a wound that refused to heal. For centuries, folk would carry soil from that cleft to scatter on their fields or tuck into coffins. Holy earth, they believed, blessed by grief. But there's another side to that holiness, isn't there? Always is. The same mountain that housed a chapel to St. Michael, the angel who cast down Satan, also bore the devil's table on its slopes. Great slabs of stone where the Dark One himself was said to play cards with Jack o' Kent, that trickster giant of Welsh legend, sacred and profane twisted together like rope. And this inn sits right at the mountain's foot, in its shadow, breathing its air. Now, you might wonder what all this has to do with a traveller stopping for the night, hoping for a hot meal and a dry bed. Everything, I'd say. Because this building isn't just stone and timber, it's a palimpsest. You know that word? It's when you scrape the ink off an old manuscript and write something new on top. But the old words never quite disappear. They show through, bleed through. This inn's like that. Layer upon layer of history, each one darker than the last, and all of them still visible if you know how to look. The Welsh Marches were never gentle country. The March, the borderland, where English law grew thin and the Lord's Marcher made their own justice. This wasn't some peaceful hamlet. This was the frontier. When the Normans came, they built their castles and imposed their will with iron and fire. Abergavenny Castle, just down the road, saw one of the bloodiest treacheries in Welsh history. William de Braose, the ogre of Abergavenny, they called him, invited the Welsh nobility to a Christmas feast in 1175. A feast under the flag of truce, sacred hospitality, the ancient law that a guest at your table is under your protection. He slaughtered them all, barred the doors and butchered them where they sat. The hall running red while the Yuletide candles burned. The castle's a ruin now, but the memory didn't die. It migrated. Stories do that in these parts. They drift from the places of power to the places where people still gather. And people gather in pubs. So the massacre of the nobles in the folk memory moved from the castle hall to the inn's hearth. Different location, same violation of the oldest law, that a host who murders his guests has damned himself beyond redemption. That's the first layer, the Norman blood. The second came 2 centuries later. Owain Glyndwr, the last true Prince of Wales, raised his banner against the English crown. This inn, or whatever stood here then, was a rallying point. Right there in the courtyard, they say. Glyndwr mounted the stone block and called his men to arms. The fires they lit in the English towns could be seen from the Skirrid's peak. And when the rebellion failed, when Henry's forces came hunting, retribution was swift. The guilty and the innocent alike swung from English rope, their bodies left for the crows. That's the second layer, the rebels' noose. But the third layer? That's the one that still stains the walls. That's the one you can feel in the wood. Somewhere in the 17th century, this inn became a court of law. Not the high courts, mind you. Not the grand assizes in the county towns. This was manorial justice, the Lord of Abergavenny's steward presiding over disputes and crimes too petty for the king's judges to bother with. Property boundaries, unpaid debts, poaching, sheep stealing. A capital offence in Britain until the 1830s. Hang a man for taking a ewe to feed his children. The court sat in this very room. The long table where you're leaning your elbows, that could have been the bench. The accused would stand where you're sitting, his hands bound, while the steward read the charges and the room fell silent. Justice was summary. No lawyers, no appeal. If the sentence was death, the beam was ready. The beam. Look up. See that oak timber spanning the stairwell? Ship's timber, some say, though we're miles from any sea. Older than the building itself, they claim. Strong enough to bear any weight. And scarred. If you run your hand along it, which I don't recommend, but some do, you can feel the grooves. The old folks say those are rope marks. The friction of hemp against oak, worn deep by use. 180 souls, the legend claims. 180 men who climbed those stairs and never came down. Not walking anyway. The fire's burning low. Let me add another log before I go on. There. Listen to it hiss and crackle. That sound, wet wood on flame. You'll want to remember that. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't myth or fancy. It's written in the wood, in the stone, in the very air you're breathing. This inn was a place where law and death were the same thing. Where a sentence, spoken in this room, was carried out 10 steps away, on a staircase you'll climb to reach your bed tonight. And the method they used, well, that's what makes it linger. Right then, let me tell you about the mechanics of it, because understanding how it was done is what makes the horror real. When you think of a hanging, you picture a gallows, don't you? A platform, a trapdoor, the condemned standing with a hood over their face while the executioner pulls the lever. The body drops through the floor, the rope goes taut, and the neck snaps clean. Quick, clinical. That's the long drop, invented in the 1870s to make it humane, if you can call any killing that. But in the 17th century, in a coaching inn on the Welsh border, there was no trapdoor, there was no platform, there was only the staircase, The beam you saw spans the stairwell about 8 feet up. Oak, solid as iron, fixed into the stone walls on either side. The accused would be brought up from the cell. There's a small room halfway up those stairs, windowless as a tomb, where they'd be held after sentencing, just large enough for a man to stand or crouch. They'd smell the wood smoke from the tap room below, hear the ordinary sounds of the inn carrying on. Voices, laughter, the clink of pewter, while they waited in the dark. Then the door would open. Hands would grip their arms. They'd be walked up 3, maybe 4 more steps, onto a narrow landing. The noose would already be prepared. Good hemp rope, the kind used for ship's rigging, strong enough to hold a sail in a gale. One end thrown over the beam, the other fashioned into a slip knot. The loop would go over their head, tightened under the jaw, and then they'd be pushed, not dropped, pushed. Off the step, into empty air, with nothing beneath them but the flagstone floor 12 feet below. The rope would catch them perhaps 3 feet into the fall, enough to stop the body, but not enough to break the neck. They'd hang there, suspended, their feet kicking for perches that didn't exist. The windpipe crushed but not severed. The brain starved of air but still conscious. It took minutes, long, thrashing minutes. The body doesn't give up easily. It fights, twists. The hands claw at the rope, but by then the strength is already draining away. The face darkens, the tongue swells, the eyes, well, best not to dwell on that. Below, in the tap room, the noise of the inn would continue. Perhaps someone would glance toward the stairwell, see the shadow swaying against the wall in the firelight, then return to their ale. This was the Marches. This was justice. This was what happened when you took what wasn't yours, or spoke against the Lord, or simply had the misfortune to be in the wrong place when examples needed to be made. When the body finally stopped moving, they'd cut it down and lay it on the stone slab at the foot of the stairs. That slab's still there, though most folk don't know what it was used for. They think it's decorative, architectural, but if you touch it on certain nights, they say it's cold in a way stone shouldn't be. Cold like a butcher's block, like something that's absorbed too much death to ever warm again. Now, the name that's attached to all this, the name that draws the ghost hunters and the curious, is Judge Jeffreys, George Jeffreys, 1st Baron Jeffreys of Wemere. The hanging judge, the man who presided over the bloody assizes of 1685, when the West Country ran red with the blood of rebels who'd backed the wrong prince. The story goes that Jeffreys held court here, in this inn, and personally ordered those 180 executions, that he sat at that table with his wig and his gavel, suffering from kidney stones that made him savage with pain, and condemned men with a cruelty that shocked even his own era. That his ghost still walks these corridors, imperious and merciless, the embodiment of judicial tyranny. Here's the truth, as near as history can tell it. Jeffreys probably never set foot in this building. The bloody assizes happened, certainly. Over 300 men hanged or transported in the aftermath of Monmouth's failed rebellion. But those trials were held in the market towns of Somerset and Dorset, not in the Welsh borderlands. Jeffreys needed space for his retinue, for the spectacle of royal justice. A village inn wouldn't suit. So why does his name cling to this place like smoke to wool? Because he's the archetype, the boogeyman of British law. His name became shorthand for judicial murder, for the kind of authority that cares nothing for mercy or truth. when folk in these valleys told stories about the cruel judge who hanged men by the dozen, Jeffreys was the name that fit. The cultural memory of the bloody assizes, which happened barely 60 miles away, merged with the local memory of manorial courts and summary executions. The timeline collapsed, the geography blurred, and Jeffreys, already a monster in the national imagination, became the monster of this particular inn. It's not factually true, but it's true in the way folklore is true, as a container for collective fear. The 180 deaths, that number's likely a compression of decades, maybe centuries, of hangings in this region. Every sheep thief strung up on a Colnbrook gibbet, every rebel caught in the hills after Glyndwr's defeat, every manorial court that ended with the rope, all of it flowed downhill like rainwater and pooled here, in this building, on this staircase, because this is where the living still gather. This is where the story can still be told. The beam remembers, even if the records don't. If you stand beneath it on a quiet night, and I've done this, fool that I am, you can feel something in the air, a thickness, a weight that isn't quite physical. Some say it's suggestion, the power of knowing what happened. Others say it's the accumulated despair of all those who climbed those stairs, knowing they'd never descend. I couldn't tell you which it is. I only know that when I stood there at 3 a.m, alone, with nothing but the creak of old timber and the wind outside, my throat tightened, not painfully, just a pressure, a phantom constriction, as if the air itself was remembering how to choke. There's a term for what happens here. Ostension, the scholars call it. The enactment of legend. When you walk the path the condemned walked, when you put your hand on the wood they touched, the story stops being historical and becomes immediate. The past isn't past anymore. It's right there, separated from you by nothing more than time. And time's a thinner barrier than you'd think in a place like this. Not everyone feels it. Some visitors climb those stairs and feel nothing but the pleasant tiredness of a long day's travel. They sleep sound in the rooms above and wake refreshed. But others, enough others that the pattern holds, report the same thing. The tightness in the throat, the sudden cold, the sense of someone standing just behind them on the stairs, close enough to touch. Though when they turn, there's nothing there but shadow. And then there's the smell. Not always, but often enough. The smell of scalding water or burning hair, sharp and acrid, cutting through the usual scents of the pub. The hops and wood polish and old stone. It comes and goes in seconds, but it's unmistakable. The paranormal investigators who've spent nights here with their gadgets and recorders can't explain it. There's no source, no boiler nearby, no chemical that could produce it. But if you've ever been in a room where meat's being prepared, where the bristles are being burned off a pig carcass, or water's being boiled for scalding, you'd recognize it immediately. It's the smell of preparation, bodies being processed. The official records don't survive, if they ever existed. Parish registers from that period are spotty at best. The manorial court rolls that might have listed the sentences are long gone, destroyed in fires or floods or simple neglect. What remains is the building itself. The beam, the stairs, the slab, and the stories. But there's another presence here, and she's nothing to do with judges or ropes, or the weight of history's cruelty. She's something gentler, though no less persistent. Her name was Fanny Price, and she died in this inn in 1875, aged 35, consumption having eaten away her lungs until there was nothing left to breathe with. She was a barmaid, or perhaps a landlady. The details vary. What doesn't vary is that she loved this place, cared for it, kept it clean and warm and welcoming, even as her own body failed her. And when she died, she didn't leave. They buried her in the churchyard at Llanfihangel Crucifixion, third grave from the right, front row. You can see the stone if you care to walk up there. Moss covered now, the lettering worn smooth by weather. But her presence is here, not there. You'll know Fanny by the lavender. In a pub that smells of beer and smoke and centuries of occupation, the sudden scent of lavender is impossible to miss. It comes without warning, usually in the upper rooms, what used to be the family quarters, where she would have slept and dressed and tended to her daily work. Some guests report it so strongly, they've searched for the source, convinced someone must have spilled perfume or lit a scented candle. But there's never anything there. She's not frightening. If anything, she's protective. The genius Loci, the spirit of the place. The one who ensures the fire's banked properly, the doors are locked, the house is kept right. Several landlords over the years have reported small kindnesses that can't quite be explained. A drop key that appears on the bar in the morning. A door left ajar that closes itself against the draft. A sense of being watched over rather than watched. The contrast is deliberate, I think. The universe balancing its books. For every rope that's strangled, a hand that soothes. For every judicial murder, a domestic kindness. Fanny is the inn's conscience, the memory of what this place was supposed to be before the hanging started. A refuge, a hearth, a home. The beam's still there, of course. You can touch it if you've a mind to. Most do, eventually. The curious ones, the ones who've heard the stories and want to test them against their own senses. They'll climb those stairs, casual at first, as if they're just heading up to use the facilities or have a look at the upper rooms. And then they'll pause, reach up, run their fingers along that oak. Some feel nothing, just old wood, smooth in places, rough in others. They'll laugh, relieved or perhaps disappointed, and carry on with their evening. But others, and this is where it gets interesting, others will snatch their hand back as if burned, not from heat, from cold. A cold that runs deeper than temperature, that seems to come from inside the timber itself, as if the wood has been storing winter for 300 years and finally found a way to let it out. In 2002, a group came through with all their equipment, electromagnetic sensors, temperature gauges, recording devices, the full paranormal investigators kit. They'd have been to dozens of haunted sites across Britain, they said, measured everything that could be measured, documented everything that could be documented. They approached it scientifically, they claimed, skeptically. They weren't here to confirm the stories, they were here to test them. They set up their instruments throughout the building, cameras in the corners, sensors on the stairs, microphones in the rooms where the activity was supposed to be strongest. Then they settled in to wait, the way you wait for something that probably won't happen but might. If you're patient enough and quiet enough and the conditions are right. At 3 a.m, always 3, isn't it? The dead hour, when the body's at its lowest ebb and the veil is thinnest. Every gauge they had redlined simultaneously, not gradually, not one by one, all at once, as if something had walked into the room that was so present, so concentrated, that the instruments couldn't cope with measuring it. The temperature in the stairwell dropped 20 degrees in 30 seconds. The electromagnetic field spiked to levels that shouldn't exist outside a lightning strike. And on their audio recording, clear as church bells, a single word: John. Not shouted, not whispered. Spoken in a voice that had weight and texture. The voice of someone used to being obeyed. They played it back 17 times that night, trying to find an explanation. Stray radio signal, cross-contamination from another device, anything but what it sounded like, a name spoken by someone who wasn't there. They packed up at dawn and left, polite about it, professional, but they left. The equipment went back in its cases, the cameras came down, and they've never returned. One of them, interviewed later for a paranormal magazine, would only say, "Some places don't want to be measured, they want to be believed." The locals have always believed. They don't need instruments to tell them what they've known for generations. They know which rooms in the inn go cold for no reason. They know the stair that creaks differently from the others, the third from the top, which sounds less like wood settling and more like a footfall, heavy and deliberate. They know that the cell halfway up, that windowless cupboard where the condemned were held, has a door that locks itself from the inside, despite having no mechanism that would allow it. And they know about the slab, that stone at the foot of the stairs, where the bodies were laid after cutting down. People have tried to remove it over the years, during renovations or modernizations. It's just a piece of stone after all. Architectural salvage could be replaced with something cleaner, more level, easier to maintain. But every time it's been lifted, things go wrong. Tools break. Workers injure themselves. The building itself seems to resist, as if the stone is load-bearing in ways that have nothing to do with structure. So it stays. They built around it now, incorporated it into the floor plan, and folk have learned not to stand on it for too long. Not because anything happens, at least nothing you could point to, but because it feels wrong, like standing on a grave that's not quite empty. The inn itself has changed hands many times. Landlords come and go, drawn by the history and the steady stream of visitors who want to sleep in Britain's most haunted pub. Some stay for years. Others last mere months before they've had enough of the footsteps overhead when the rooms are empty, the doors that won't stay closed, the sense of being constantly observed by eyes that have no business still watching. But the building endures. It's Grade 2 listed now, protected by English heritage as a structure of historical importance. You can't tear it down or alter it significantly without permission from people who care deeply about preserving the past, which means the beam stays, the stairs stay, the slab stays. All of it locked in place by law and heritage and the weight of centuries. They serve a decent pint, I'm told. The food's good. The rooms are comfortable, or as comfortable as rooms in a 900-year-old building can be. People still stop here on their way through the valley, drawn by the name or the recommendation, or simply the need for a rest. Most have no idea what they're walking into. They see a charming Welsh country inn, all whitewashed walls and slate roof, and they think picturesque. It's only later, after they've settled in and the evening's grown long and the fire's burned down to embers, that someone mentions the stories. Maybe the landlord, if they're the storytelling type. Maybe another guest who's done their research. And then the atmosphere shifts. The shadows deepen. The creaks in the floorboards overhead take on new meaning. Some ask to move rooms. Some leave entirely, making excuses about early starts or changes of plan. But others, the curious ones, the brave ones, or perhaps just the stubborn ones, stay. They climb those stairs with the beam overhead and the slab below, and they sleep in rooms where the dead are said to walk, and they wake in the morning changed in ways they can't quite articulate. Not traumatized, not frightened exactly, but aware. Aware that history isn't something that happened once and finished. It's something that lingers, that seeps into wood and stone and air, that waits. The still gets his measure of ale on the mantelpiece. That customs never lapsed, not in all the centuries this place has stood. Some call it superstition, others call it respect, but I'd call it acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that in the shadow of the holy mountain, under the gaze of those ancient stones, there are older laws than the ones written in statute books. There are bargains that must be kept and boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. The fair folk get their due. Fanny gets her lavender and her quiet rooms, and the beam, well, the beam gets its memory. The rope marks, real or imagined, will never quite fade. The wood will never quite warm, and the stairs will never be just stairs again, not to those who know. The fire's nearly gone now. Look at that. Just embers glowing in the dark, like small red eyes watching from the ash. The wind's dropped too, finally. You'll have a clear walk wherever you're headed, which is more than many had who passed through this valley. But before you go, let me pour you one more. Here's to the condemned who climbed those stairs, to Fanny Price, who stayed when she should have gone, to the holy mountain that split with grief and never healed, and to the Pwca, who keeps his bargains and expects us to keep ours. Here's to the places that remember, the wood that holds its scars, the stone that won't warm, the rope marks that won't fade, no matter how many hands try to smooth them away. And here's to the understanding that some stories aren't meant to comfort us. They're meant to remind us that the past is never as past as we'd like it to be. Now then, off with you. Mind how you go, especially on those roads through the valley. They're narrow and dark, and the Skirrid casts a long shadow even by daylight. And if you're ever back this way, if you find yourself standing at the foot of those stairs with your hand hovering near that beam, remember what I told you. Some places don't want to be measured. They want to be believed. And belief in a place like this has weight, has consequence. You might feel your throat tighten just for a moment. You might smell something sharp and acrid that has no business being there. You might sense someone standing just behind you, close enough to touch. Don't turn around too quickly. Whatever you do, don't turn around too quickly. Just climb the stairs at your own pace. Touch the beam if you must. Stand in the cell if you're curious. But remember that you're walking through history, and history here has teeth. The Skirrid Inn doesn't forget. The beam doesn't forget. And neither, I suspect, do those who swung from it all those years ago, fighting for air that wouldn't come. Some beds, they say, were never meant for sleeping, and some stairs were never meant only for climbing. Sleep well, traveller, if you can. You've been listening to British Pub Lore. Mind how you go.